Good morning and welcome. I hope today is finding you in good spirits and in good health, and that you're prospering in all the ways that God has ordained for your life. And if you're like me, my prayer is that this week our nation will be at peace as opposed to last week. I introduced a series I did last week on calling it The Great Disruption, and it turned out to be really the Great Eruption as riots and anarchy and violence broke out in almost every major city in the country. And all based upon a rather tragic event. You had a gentleman by the name of George Floyd who was killed by police officers, and the courts will determine what their degree of liability and culpability is. But nonetheless, it was a horrible. If you watch that video, it was just horrifying to watch a man having his life really squeezed out of him. But what I find really kind of fascinating is that someone like George Floyd would kind of rise to the surface as being kind of a emblem of what it means to be a persecuted person. And I don't know enough about his personal life. I know that it was a life that was pretty tragic. But I think where we've come from, it used to be when I was during the 60s and the 70s, we looked at Martin Luther King as being really a role model. In fact, probably the most defining moment of this day is the speech that he delivered at the Washington Mall in front of 250,000 people. There's parts of it that just really always have resonated with me. I think it's clearly one of the best, greatest speeches that was ever written. But he made this comment. He says, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of the creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream that one day on the red hills of Georgia, the son of former slaves and the sons of former slave owners will be able to sit down together at the table of brotherhood. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. And I have a dream today." It's an interesting phrase because he mentions the content of a person's character. And I look at somebody like George Floyd, and as tragic as his death was, it's something that probably wasn't unforeseen. The man had been imprisoned 5 times, one for violent armed robbery of a pregnant woman in her home, an invasion robbery, threatened to kill her. And he had a lifelong problem with drug addiction. And ultimately, when he did die, they found, that he was both on fentanyl and methamphetamine. And so, he could have very likely have just died in the street because of the drug addiction. But because of the context, it's become kind of a rallying call against all forms of injustice, or at least a certain kind of injustice. And I think that that's what really creates a problem, because you and I have to be careful that we don't look at something like this and begin to go to the other extreme and not consider what really took place and why we should care. In other words, how should we respond to what we're seeing being played out on the news and reading in the newspaper and online and so forth? And I would just like to say there are 3 things I think we need to really kind of work towards. Number 1, I think we got to begin with compassion. We don't know what it's like to be a person of color. Most of us don't. I'm sorry if there's some of you who do. But we really don't understand it. We don't understand what that's like. That we don't understand that bigotry still exists in all of its evil, pernicious, and satanic forms. And it can take a lot of different forms. Sometimes we can look at somebody critically because of the way they dress, or because of their age, or their lifestyle, or any number of things. And the problem isn't that we disagree or don't approve of what they're doing. I mean, that's fair. If you think that somebody's behaving incorrectly, then that's fair to make that judgment. In fact, we all make that judgment without even thinking about it. But what's the problem is that we devalue the person in the process, that we look across the room and we see a person that fits into a certain mental profile we have, and we begin to see their value as being less worth than of our own or those we love. So compassion realizes that every person, first and foremost, is made in the image of God, and I need to value that basically that core essence of who they are as a person. George Floyd was made in God's image, and George Floyd was terribly flawed and damaged for various reasons that I don't even know. But nonetheless, he didn't deserve to die that way. And nobody deserves to be cast away. So when you see somebody, a homeless person on the street, you could say statistically it's really likely that they're a drug addict or they are mentally ill or both. But it's also possible that they're just somebody who was abused or who was thrown out and has fallen upon hard times and doesn't know how to get out of the hole they're in. So I think that that's where we should learn to start, caring about people simply because they're people. The second thing is empathy is trying to put ourselves in their place, trying to understand what they're going through. I mean, I experienced this when I was a hippie, I remember hitchhiking and having people, try to run me off the road with their cars. I don't know if they intended to kill me, but they came close enough to scare me to death. I had people throw things at me. They certainly yelled at me a lot. I got kicked out of restaurants. I was told in some places I couldn't come in the store. I mean, I had never experienced it before. And I remember the time thinking to myself, this must be what it's like to be an African American or Hispanic or somebody else who's simply just treated poorly because of the appearance that they come with. And that was healthy for me. It really began to affect me and change me in a way that made me much more compassionate and understanding, especially when I see people who are suffering because of things they can't control. But the third thing, I think, is not only compassion, not only empathy, but more importantly, maybe prayer. In fact, the prayer doesn't really prove to be very effective if we're not compassionate and we're not empathetic. But really, Paul put it this way in 2 Corinthians 5:18. He says, all things are of God, who hath reconciled us to himself by Jesus Christ and has given us the ministry of reconciliation. He's given to you and I the ministry. I love what Martin Luther King said, that he had this dream that one day in the red hills of Georgia, the former slaves and the sons of former slave owners would be able to sit down together at the same table of brotherhood at the same time. Wouldn't that be wonderful? Wouldn't that be beautiful if we could sit down across from people who are vastly different from us and we may completely disagree with, and yet we're able to have an informed conversation where we're speaking to a person and not just relating platitudes? That's part of the idea that I don't simply draw a conclusion about who you are by my preconceived notions or even my past experiences with somebody like you. I just simply choose to take one person at a time and evaluate that person based upon who is in front of me at this moment, the content of their character. Well, that's a challenging thing to do, but I hope it is something that you and I will be able to kind of work on this week as we interact with a lot of different people in a lot of different ways, that we would be concerned about helping people have good character content and to evaluate people we meet by that. And God bless you and go in his grace.